Hi everyone. We're going to look at Magnus Carlsen's games from the last day of the World Rapid Championships. So here are the standings before the round 10 begins. So Carlsen is in the sole lead with 7.5 points. And half a point behind him, we've got Noterbek Abdusadarov from Uzbekistan. We've got Alexander Grishuk and Jan Nepomniachtchi, all with 7 points. So let's take a look at Carlsen's first game of the day, round 10. He's playing Abdusadarov, and Carlsen has the black pieces. So we have an English opening, King's English, 4 knights variation. And Abdusadarov goes for e4, which is the Nimzowitsch variation. And Carlsen gets his dark squared bishop outside of his pawn chain, and it gets attacked. And Abdusadarov goes for the bishop pair. Okay, Carlsen brings his other bishop up, pins the knight. Knight takes b6. Okay, bishop b2. And Carlsen voluntarily gives up his other bishop. And so now we have 2 bishops versus 2 knights. The position is closed, so Carlsen is going to try to keep it that way and argue that the knights are better. Okay, knight d7, g3. Carlsen offers a queen exchange. White declines. Knight f8, bishop g2, knight e6. So pretty balanced, even opening, 0.0 according to the engines. So we're going to skip ahead to this position. So still balanced material here, but white has this passed pawn on the 7th rank, and Carlsen decides to attack it and win it. And in exchange, white goes after black's h-pawn. So they trade pawns like this, and we get an ending here where white has this passed h-pawn, which white nurses for a long time and starts to push it up the board and gets it quite far. It becomes quite dangerous. Let's skip ahead to this position. White is in check, so we have a queen and pawn endgame. Carlsen has an extra pawn, but there is that dangerous h-pawn that Abdusadarov has pushed all the way to h6. Okay, king h4, f4, queen d7 check, b5, and he pushes his pawn all the way to h7. And so Carlsen protects the h8 square. So they play quite a number of moves in this queen and pawn endgame. And I checked both the engines and the endgame table bases, and it turns out both players made many mistakes and blunders. So it's a very difficult ending to play, especially at rapid time controls. It's really impossible for humans to play up to par with the table bases. So for example, Carlsen's move right there, queen to e5, is a mistake. It's a blunder. It loses the game. But it's not easy to take advantage or even to see why it is losing. So both players play on for quite a while. Let's jump ahead. Okay, so in this position, Carlsen has the h-pawn blockaded by his queen, and things are looking grim. White is about to win black's last pawn and probably come over and help this pawn queen. So the engine says Carlsen's position is actually lost, and white goes for this check, and Carlsen makes it very easy on his young opponent. He plays king a1, stepping into this fork. So Carlsen resigns because if he takes the queen and exchanges, the white pawn will queen. So Carlsen probably could have put up more of a fight here. He could have stayed off of the a1 square and stayed on the light squares instead. like king b1, for example. The engine tells me it's still something like mate in 25, or the table bases say that. In fact, this kind of endgame is so complicated that throughout this queen and pawn endgame, the engines often had it wrong, according to the table bases. Sometimes the engines would claim that the position is drawish, but then the table bases would say it's 1 for white. So it's very difficult, and black could have, stayed away from that fork for a while, and it might have given him some chances to survive. Okay, but Carlsen loses that round. It's his first loss of the tournament, and we're going to take a look at the standings again. So after round 10 is over, here are the standings. So now with that win, Abdusattorov is tied for first place with 8 points with Jan Nepomniachtchi. So Carlsen is half a point behind, along with Caruana. And a full point behind the leaders, we have a large group of players, including Nakamura, Firouzja, a couple players I have my eye on. So let's go ahead and turn to round 11. So here Carlsen is playing Nepo, and Carlsen has the white pieces. This is their first game since the World Championship. And Carlsen goes for d4. And they play a Catalan, which was also played in the championship, the classical World Championship. And we get this position. And bishop f4 is a very rare move by Carlsen. Nepo takes on c4, and Carlsen brings his queen out to collect the pawn back up on c4. Okay, knight d5 attacks the dark squared bishop, and Carlsen ignores that and lets him take it. But before taking it, Nepo plays a very interesting move here. He plays a pawn sacrifice b5. Let's see what the purpose of it is. Carlsen takes the pawn, and then black takes the bishop and messes up the pawn structure on the king side here. Okay, knight to a6 is played, okay, a3, and now we can see that with that pawn sacrifice on b5, black is unraveling his queen side in a hurry here. He's getting his rook out with tempo, and he's going to win that pawn on b2 as well. Queen c4, rook takes b2. Okay, we get some moves here. White castles, exchanging pawns on d4. The knight comes into c5. A nice square protected by the bishop, and this allows the a6 square to be occupied by the light squared bishop. In fact, it looks like black may be threatening to trap that queen, which is light on squares, but Carlsen has things under control because he can always interpose with a knight. Okay, knight cb5, he does that preemptively. Queen b6. Okay, knight c6. Okay, so Nepo preserves his dark squared bishop there and points it right at the a1 rook. Carlsen moves the rook. Bishop a6, pinning the knight, attacking it for the third time. Okay, so Carlsen exchanges rooks here and then pushes his pawn to a4 to solidify his knight. Okay, but then knight takes a4, removes the defender of that knight, offering up the knight here on a4, but then black gets the knight on b5 in exchange. So for the moment, black is up a pawn. Let's see what happens. Queen takes queen, bishop takes back, and now Carlsen could go for the pawn on a7 to restore the material for the moment, but don't forget the pawn on e2 is also hanging. So something like this could occur, and black has a very strong edge in this kind of a position, a pawn up with the two bishops. So Carlsen didn't go for that pawn. Instead, he played a very nice idea, knight to e7 check, getting his knight out of the way, and then playing this rook to b1. So threatening to win a piece here, skewering the bishops. So what black has to do is move his dark square bishop and attack the knight. He can do it two different ways. It doesn't really matter. He plays bishop f6. Carlsen takes the light square bishop, and then Nepo takes the knight. Now after rook a5, it turns out Carlsen collects up his pawn anyway. There's no way to defend the pawn. The a8 square is covered, so that pawn's going to fall. Bishop d6. Okay, Carlsen decides to get rid of that weak pawn on f5. Okay, if he wanted to preserve it, it's under attack, he could defend it, but that would allow black to drop back and defend his own a pawn. So Carlsen just gives it up. He pushes to f5. Black takes it. Rook takes back. And we have a very drawish position here. We've got the opposite colored bishops. All the pawns are on the same side of the board. So it turns out the game was drawn, and here's the final position. So not much action. Even though black has an extra pawn, it doesn't really mean anything. So let's have a look at the standings after round 11. Okay, so Carlsen started out the day with a loss and a draw. So slow start for Carlsen. And Abdusadarov and Nepo still have the lead. Both drew their games. They're at 8.5. And Carlsen, Gristruck, Nakamura won his game. Aronian, Caruana, and Gukesh are all at 8 points, half a point behind the leader. I was interested in this player, Gukesh, I've never heard of, a young Indian grandmaster. I noticed his rating here is 2050. That's his rapid rating, but don't let that fool you. He is a grandmaster. I don't know why his rapid rating is so low. I guess he just hasn't been playing rapid. I think he's only 15 years old. It's tough growing up in your prime, getting your grandmaster title during COVID times. Probably not a lot of opportunities to play. So he's having a great tournament. You look at his seed number over here, 174, and he's in 8th place. Okay. All right, so let's see what happens in round 12. So in round 12, Carlsen is paired with Aronian, and Carlsen has the white pieces. So Carlsen starts with d4, d5, get a queen's gambit, and Aronian goes for a queen's gambit accepted. Okay, and Carlsen plays e3 here. There are a couple of other popular moves. e3 is good. I'll just talk about the theory a little bit. You can push your pawn to e4 and claim a big center, but then black can immediately attack the center with e5, and you've got two pieces pressuring that pawn. Most players here play knight f3. You can push the pawn to d5, but that's not great because once you split these pawns up, then black gets some squares. For example, this diagonal opens up, and at some point that pawn on d5 can be attacked with c6. So normally white plays knight f3 here, and we get something like this, and that's a pretty common position. Okay, also instead of e4 or e3, you can play knight f3. I think that's the most common move in the position. And then something like this, knight f6, e3, and white is attacking the pawn, and black pushes e6, white takes the pawn, and then black immediately strikes at the center with c5. Castle, a6, d takes, queen takes, rook takes, bishop takes back on c5. And we get a pretty symmetrical position, but white has a slight lead in development, having already been castled and brought his rook to the d file. So a slight edge for white in that particular line. But Carlsen goes for a very solid e3, which is what I usually play against the queen's gambit accepted. Then knight f6. I'll point out, if you're not familiar with the queen's gambit accepted, it's not advisable to defend that pawn with b5. it's not a really, the queen's gambit is not really a true gambit. Black cannot really hang on to the gambit pawn without seriously damaging his position. So in this particular case, white should try to break down that pawn structure with a4 right away. And there's really nothing black can do to retain his material. For example, if he decides to defend with a6, that doesn't work because white takes on b5 anyway, and black cannot take back because the rook on a8 would fall. Also, nicer trap that beginners fall into is c6. That's also a mistake. White can again take, and black cannot take back because of the powerful queen f3 hitting the rook in the corner, and black just has to give up a full piece like this. Okay, also after a4, if black decides to take on a4, then all four of these pawns are weak, and white can start collecting right away with, for example, queen takes a4 check, and then queen takes c4. So there's really no way to hold on to the material there. Okay, that's just a little lesson in theory. Let's go back to the game. So knight f6 was played. Okay, Carlsen takes the pawn, e6, knight f3, pretty standard stuff following theory. Okay, a4 is designed to stop black from expanding with b5. Okay, black takes on d4. So white gets this isolated d pawn in this position. Knight c6 attacks it, knight c3. Okay, the bishops come out, black castles, queen e2. Okay, so Carlsen wants to put a rook on d1 to support the pawn. b6, rook a d1, knight comes forward, knight centralizes, bishop gets fianchettoed, and now a very interesting move by Carlsen. He plays f4. His idea is actually to play f5 and try to break down this pawn and open the scope for his bishop here. And it looks like Aronian is stopping that with g6, so he's got a solid grip on the f5 square. Well, then Carlsen makes a great move here and pushes f5 anyway. Okay, let's look at both captures. It turns out that both of them have their drawbacks. Aronian captured with the e pawn. If he had captured with the g pawn, he's just opening up his king. For example, white could play bishop to h6, hitting the rook, and if the rook slides over, then there's this nice tactic, knight takes f7. Okay, hitting the queen and undermining the support of the e6 pawn. If the king takes, then black's going to lose after this check. Okay, so we'll go back and look at what Aronian played. So Aronian took with the e pawn, which keeps the king side a little safer looking. But here's the point of Carlsen's pawn sacrifice f5. He has bishop h6, hitting the rook. And now that this pawn is cleared out of the way, if the rook moves, then f7 falls with check, and white can even pick up the exchange if he wants to. Or white can consider taking with the knight, giving a possible discovered check. Okay, so knight db5 was tried to block the effect of the bishop, just offering up the exchange. Okay, Carlsen doesn't take the exchange. He continues to attack with g4. Very energetic game. It gets very chaotic here. Very difficult for me to understand. b5, a takes b5, a takes b5, bishop b3. Aronian takes back, or takes on c3, b takes c3, rook a3, and now finally Carlsen decides to take on f8. Okay, so Aronian takes the bishop, Carlsen takes on e7, queen takes back, g takes f5, okay, knight to d5, f takes g6, threatening to expose the black king entirely with one of these pawn captures. So Aronian decides to take back with the f pawn. So the engine tells me that Aronian did defend pretty well. And if we look at the position now, Carlson is up the exchange. But black's pieces are pretty active. This bishop is well placed. The queen can come in. The king over here on g1 is not so safe. So it's a really wide open position. White should have an edge in the position, but it's not necessarily an easy win. Okay, rook d e1. Okay, black takes the pawn. Knight g4. Queens get exchanged. So Carlson is willing to go into an endgame with his material advantage. So his attack kind of fizzled out. Okay, the knights get exchanged. Carlson goes after the b pawn. Attacks the bishop. Check. Okay, attacks h7. Takes on h7. King moves up. Carlson takes the b pawn and Aronian takes the d pawn. So again, still Carlson has the rook for the bishop. One pawn each. Rook b2. I thought this was a mistake. I think Aronian should probably try to keep the rooks on the board, not trade off his last rook here. This allows rook g2 to block the check, and now Aronian's rook is pinned, so Carlson can trade rooks if he wants to. Aronian decides to initiate the trade, then plays king f4, rook h4 check, king e5, king g3. So the table bases tell me that this is a win for white. It does not look easy though, but Carlson makes it look easy. Let's jump ahead a little bit. There's a lot of maneuvering that goes on. Eventually we get to this position, and Carlson plays rook h5 check. King moves to e4, and then Carlson seizes an opportunity here, makes things very easy with rook g5. He's threatening to take on g4, giving the exchange back, and then his h-pawn is going to queen. If you have the sideways opposition, if Carlson's king is on g4 and Aronian's is on e4, then he's blocking that king out from getting into the corner, getting in front of that pawn, and so the pawn will queen. And black can't really do anything about this. He cannot improve his king right now. The rook has it cut off. So Carlson's next move is going to be rook takes g4. This is what happens, but Aronian knows that this particular endgame is one for white. He can try to run up towards the h8 square, but Carlson would have it covered like this. He can run back for the pawn, but the pawn can queen. So Aronian knew that was the case, and so he did not take the rook after Carlson won the pawn. He just decided to play on anyway. It's pretty hopeless with the rook and the h-pawn, but he gives it a try. Carlson makes some progress, pushing the pieces up the board. And eventually right here, black resigned. So the game might have went something like this: bishop h7 blockading the pawn, rook g7, bishop falls back, rook moves over, defends the pawn laterally to come forward. So white can make some progress here, and he's going to queen his pawn. Okay, so Carlson wins, and he gets back to an even score for the day. So one loss, one draw, one win. And there's one round left in the tournament. Let's take a look at the standings after this round 12 has been completed. So after 12 rounds, here's what we have. Still, Abdusadarov and Nepo are in the lead with 9, but Carlson just joined him with that win, and so did Caruana. So we've got 4 players at the top with 9 points, and just half a point behind them, we've got Duda, Nakamura, and Gukesh. Okay, so we're going into the last round, and I'll mention something about the tie-break scenario. Right now, Abdusadarov has by far the best tie breaks here. And if he ties in the last round, if he's tied for the lead after the last round, that's going to be good news for him. The rules are actually in the end, if there's a tie amongst several players, only the top two players, the two players with the best tie breaks, go to a playoff. I'm not sure all the players were aware of this. We'll talk more about that. Let's look at what happens in round 13. So in round 13, we've got a pairing that a lot of fans were waiting for. Nakamura has the white pieces against Carlson. So Nakamura, remembers, a half a point behind the leaders. So if he wants any chance at tying for the lead here, he has to win this game. And Carlson's tie breaks are not so great. So he needs to win this game as well if he wants to put the championship in his own hands. He doesn't want to draw and make it easy on the other players to get into a tie break scenario. If he's tied for the lead after this round, he might not make the playoffs due to worse tiebreakers. So Nakamura plays d4, and Carlson goes for a classical d5 here, a queen's gambit declined, which is a very solid way to play, and maybe not the best way for black to go for a win. Now, some people were speculating because of the way that Carlson played, he may not be aware that only the top two tiebreak scores will go to a playoff. In fact, after the game was over, he was interviewed about the rules, and he said that the rules were idiotic. So I think he was not aware, which is his own fault. The rules are published ahead of time. He can read them. There's a players' meeting before the event started. If you have anything to say about the rules, then you should say it before the event starts at that players' meeting, and nobody spoke up and said anything about the tiebreak rules. So Carlson plays very solidly in this game. They get this bishop f4 kind of main line here, and it's not very exciting. Although queen b6 is an unusual move, usually players would put that queen on a5 and pin that knight, but it's a fine move. Okay, bishop e2, d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4, knights get exchanged, white castles, bishop d7, bishop f3, rook a d8, b4, interesting move, trying to gain some space here, cut the queen off perhaps from defending the bishop. So c5 may be threatened, although c5 does allow queen takes b4 to defend the bishop laterally. Now notice white doesn't have to worry about defending this b pawn. Black cannot take it because the queen is defending the bishop at the moment. So b4 is a nice move. Carlson goes for bishop c6, and Nakamura takes that bishop, and Carlson had a long think here and decided to take with the b pawn, which does split his pawns up, so it makes a couple isolated pawns, but he must have his reasons for doing that. The engine did prefer black to take back with the queen. So b takes c6, knight e2, e5 defends the bishop. White takes it, and then black decides to take the knight. Okay, so even material still, but black has that passed d pawn now. We do have an imbalance of minor pieces. Bishop g5. This is interesting too. This gives up the b pawn, but the purpose of it is to break up the kingside pawns here. So queen f5 attacks f6. Okay, the rook comes out, just giving up that f6 pawn, and then queen d6. Notice black doesn't want to take this pawn. That would be a draw concession because white would get a draw by perpetual here. Black doesn't want to step out into the open and face this check, so he'd kind of be forced back, and white would have a perpetual. So Carlson doesn't go for that pawn. He plays queen d6 so he can block the check on g5 with the queen, which is what happens. and then f4 is played, and Carlsen takes the queens off the board, and then plays rook e5. Rook f4 attacking the pawn, so both pawns are hanging at the moment. Carlsen plays an interesting d3. I probably would have instinctively played c5 to get a nice protected passed pawn. Then white would defend his g-pawn. Maybe this is very drawish, I don't know. So Carlsen goes for d3, rook d2, rook takes g5, rook f3, rook d4. That pawn gets taken, that pawn gets taken. Okay, and pair rooks comes off the board. Nakamura goes for that A pawn, then he goes for the C pawn, which he gets. And Carlsen ends up a pawn up here, but it doesn't really mean much. Nakamura defended perfectly. This is a drawn endgame. Nothing very interesting happens. Carlsen does press a bit, but Nakamura plays it perfectly and draws the game. So Carlsen draws his last round. Let's see what happened in the standings. So the standings after that 13th round is completed. We see a four-way tie at the top now. Abdusattorov, Nepomniachtchi, Carlsen, and Caruana all tied with 9.5. But look at the tie breaks. The top two tiebreak scores here, tiebreak number 1, are Abdusattorov and Jan Nepomniachtchi, and those are the two that go to the playoff for the World Championship. So Carlsen fell short. He does not retain his title. He comes in 3rd place in the tournament. It's also interesting to note that Caruana may not have been aware of the rules either, because he drew his last round game on move 6. He had the white pieces, and he drew on move 6. I don't know if he offered the draw or if he accepted the draw, but that's pretty inexcusable to do that with the championship on the line unless he thought he was going to a playoff. Anyway, Carlsen ends up in 3rd. We won't look at the playoff games. But Abdusattorov ended up winning, beating Nepomniachtchi 1.5 to a half in a blitz playoff. Kind of strange to decide the Rapid World Champion with blitz games, but that's what they ended up doing. I didn't really know this player, Abdusattorov, so I looked him up, and here's a picture of him. He's 17 years old. Here's his Wikipedia page. He's an Uzbek chess player and the reigning World Rapid Chess Champion. So the Wikipedia page gets updated pretty quickly. A chess prodigy, he qualified for the Grandmaster title at the age of 13 years, 1 month, and 11 days. And if we look over here, his FIDE rating, classical rating, is currently 2633. A couple months ago it was 2648, putting him at number 100 in the world. So he's an up-and-coming player too. Some people have told me he's making quite a scene on some chess.com events, maybe Title Tuesday or something. So he's somebody to watch. All right, I learned something from Magnus Carlsen this tournament. It was fun to watch, and there's a Blitz tournament coming up starting tomorrow, the Blitz World Champion, so maybe Carlsen can win that. So thanks for watching my videos.